You open your eyes to darkness, and for a moment, you're not sure if you've actually woken up at all. The room is black. Not dim, not shadowy, but absolutely, completely black. The fire in the hearth died hours ago, and the only light comes from a thin crack around the door, where the gray pre-dawn seeps through. The cold is extraordinary, a physical presence that presses against your skin like something alive. Your breath fogs in the darkness. The water in the basin by your bed has frozen solid overnight. Welcome to Salem Village. The year is 1692. The month is February. And something terrible is about to begin. You lie on a straw mattress in a house that is barely more than a wooden box with a chimney. The walls are thin, the roof leaks, and the wind cuts through gaps in the boards like knives. Your entire family sleeps in this single room. Parents, children, perhaps a grandparent or two, all huddled together for warmth, because warmth is survival, and survival is everything. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, well, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know, and honestly, the YouTube algorithm is almost as unforgiving as the Puritan God we'll be discussing shortly. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. You're lying in the freezing darkness of a Salem Village home, and you have no idea that your world is about to turn inside out. The Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1692 is not a comfortable place. The winters are brutal, the summers are short, and the land yields its harvest grudgingly. The colony is technically at war with French Canada and their Native American allies, and frontier raids have left the population traumatized and paranoid. Refugees from the destroyed settlements to the north have flooded into Essex County, bringing tales of massacre and horror. But the physical hardships are almost secondary to the spiritual ones. You live in a theocracy, a society where the church and state are effectively the same thing, where every aspect of daily life is governed by religious law, where the devil is not a metaphor, but a literal physical presence who walks among you, tempting the weak, corrupting the faithful, recruiting soldiers for his army. And in the past few weeks, strange things have been happening in Salem Village. The minister's daughter and niece have begun having fits, screaming that invisible forces are tormenting them, contorting their bodies in ways that seemed humanly impossible. The local doctor has examined them and delivered his diagnosis. The girls are suffering from the effects of witchcraft. Someone in Salem Village is a witch. Someone has made a pact with Satan, and the hunt to find them is about to tear this community apart. You don't know it yet, but within 6 months, 20 people will be dead. Hundreds will be accused. Families will be destroyed, friendships shattered, an entire society consumed by paranoia and fear. And it all starts here, in this frozen February darkness, in a village that is about to lose its mind. Get comfortable. This is going to be a long, dark night. To understand what is about to happen in Salem, you first need to understand what it means to live as a Puritan in 1692, because this is not merely a religious preference. It is a total way of life, a comprehensive system that governs every thought, every action, every moment from birth until death. The Puritans came to Massachusetts to build a holy commonwealth, a city upon a hill that would serve as a model of godly living for all the world. They believed they had a covenant with God, a special agreement that set them apart from other peoples and nations. In exchange for their faithfulness, God would bless them. If they strayed from righteousness, God would punish them. It was that simple and that terrifying. Every aspect of your daily life is regulated by religious law. You must attend church services twice on Sunday, sitting through sermons that can last 3 or 4 hours each. Missing church without a valid excuse brings fines and public censure. The services are not comfortable. The meeting house is unheated. The benches are hard. And the tithing man patrols the aisles with a long stick to poke anyone who falls asleep. The sermons themselves are exercises in spiritual terror. Your minister does not speak of a loving, forgiving God. He speaks of a God of wrath and judgment, a God who sees every sin, who knows every impure thought, who keeps a perfect account of every failing that will be read aloud on the day of judgment. He speaks of hell in vivid, visceral detail, the flames, the torments, the eternal suffering that awaits sinners. He speaks of the devil, who prowls the wilderness of Massachusetts like a roaring lion, seeking souls to devour. Sin is everywhere. Not just obvious sins like murder or theft, but subtle sins, thought sins, sins you might not even recognize as sins. Pride is a sin. Vanity is a sign. Excessive laughter is suspicious. Wearing clothing above your station is illegal. Speaking against the church or its ministers is punishable. Even your dreams can be sinful, and you're expected to examine your conscience constantly, rooting out every impure impulse. The community watches everyone. In a village of perhaps 500 people, there are no secrets. Your neighbors know when you wake, when you sleep, what you eat, how you discipline your children, whether your husband drinks too much, whether your wife is properly submissive. Gossip is technically sinful, but information flows through Salem Village like water through sand. Everyone knows everyone's business. If you sin publicly, you will face public punishment. The stocks, the pillory, the whipping post, these are not historical curiosities, but active instruments of social control. You might be forced to stand before the congregation and confess your sins in humiliating detail. You might be fined, imprisoned, or banished. In extreme cases, you might be executed. This is the world that will produce the witch trials, a world of constant surveillance, constant judgment, constant fear. The winter of 1691 to 1692 is brutal even by New England standards. And New England standards are already horrifying. You need to understand that. Massachusetts in the late 17th century is experiencing what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that makes winters longer, colder, and more deadly than anything we experience today. The harbors freeze solid for months. Snow piles up to the windows. The cold kills livestock, destroys crops, and claims human lives with casual efficiency. Your morning begins, as every morning does, with the desperate need for warmth. The fire in the hearth must be revived from last night's embers, assuming any embers survived the night. If they didn't, you face the laborious process of striking flint against steel, trying to coax a spark into the tinder, your fingers so numb you can barely feel what you're doing. Fire is life. Without fire, you freeze. Once the fire is going, you can begin to function, though the warmth extends only a few feet from the hearth. The rest of the house remains frigid. The water you need for cooking and washing must be hauled from the well, and the well is outside. And outside is a frozen wasteland, where the wind cuts through your wool clothing as if it weren't there. The food situation is precarious. By February, you're living on what you stored in the fall. Salted meat, dried beans, root vegetables buried in the cellar, barrels of cider that are now more slush than liquid. Fresh food is a distant memory and will remain so until spring, which feels impossibly far away. Hunger is a constant companion. Not starvation, usually, but the persistent gnawing of not quite enough. The weariness that comes from a diet that is monotonous, inadequate, and joyless. The previous summer was not a good one. The harvest was poor, and the reserves are running low across the region. Prices are high. Some families are genuinely struggling to feed themselves. The specter of famine haunts the colony, adding to the general atmosphere of anxiety and doom. And then there's the war. King William's War has been raging along the frontier for 3 years now, and the news from the north is consistently terrible. French soldiers and their Native American allies have raided English settlements in Maine and New Hampshire, killing and capturing hundreds. Refugees have poured into Essex County, bringing first-hand accounts of atrocities that lose nothing in the retelling. Salem Village itself has taken in displaced families, stretching resources that were already thin. The war feels close, even if the actual fighting is miles away. Every stranger is potentially a scout. Every sound in the night might be a war party. The Native Americans are widely believed to worship the devil, which means the conflict is not merely political but cosmic. A battle between Christ and Satan for control of the new world. This is the context for what's about to happen. Cold, hungry, frightened people who believe they are surrounded by enemies, both physical and spiritual. Let's examine your living conditions more closely, because the physical environment shapes everything about life in Salem Village, including the witch trials themselves. Your house is almost certainly a single-room structure, perhaps 20 feet by 16 feet, with a large fireplace at one end and a loft above for sleeping or storage. If your family is relatively prosperous, you might have a second room, but most families make do with one. The walls are made of wooden clapboards, the roof is thatched or shingled, and the floor is packed earth or rough wooden planks. Everything happens in this one room. You cook here, eat here, work here, pray here, sleep here. There is no privacy in any meaningful sense. Parents and children, sometimes servants or slaves, all share the same space. Bodily functions are managed as discreetly as possible, but discretion only goes so far when everyone lives on top of each other. The fireplace is the heart of the home, literally and figuratively. It provides the only heat, the only light in the dark winter months, and the means to cook all food. Someone must tend the fire constantly, ensuring it doesn't go out, feeding it with wood that must be cut, split, and hauled in quantities that are hard to imagine. A single household might burn 20 cords of wood per year, and every log represents backbreaking labor. Light is precious and scarce. Candles are expensive, made from tallow or bayberry wax, and used sparingly. Most families go to bed when darkness falls and rise when the sun rises, because artificial light is simply too costly to waste. In the long winter nights, this means 14 or 15 hours of darkness. Hours spent in a single room with your entire family, with nothing to do but talk or pray or brood. The darkness affects everything. People develop eye strain from trying to work in insufficient light. Accidents happen when you can't see what you're doing. And the psychological weight of all those dark hours, night after night, month after month, is considerable. Modern people rarely experience true darkness, the absolute absence of artificial light. In 1692, you experience it every single night. The furniture in your home is minimal and rough. A table, some benches or stools, perhaps a chair for the head of household. Beds are often just mattresses stuffed with straw, laid on ropes stretched across a wooden frame. Your possessions are few and precious. Iron pots, wooden trenchers, a Bible if you can read, tools for whatever trade your family practices. This cramped, dark, cold existence creates its own pressures. Tensions between family members have nowhere to dissipate. Resentments fester, conflicts simmer, and when accusations of witchcraft begin to fly, many of them will originate in these cramped households, where people know each other's business far too well. Food in Puritan New England is not about pleasure. It's about survival. And in the winter of 1692, survival is looking increasingly uncertain. If you're enjoying this journey into colonial hardship, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the food situation gets even grimmer from here. The Puritan diet is based on what can be grown, hunted or preserved in this harsh climate. Corn is the staple crop, ground into meal and used to make various forms of bread, porridge, and pudding. Wheat grows poorly in New England, so the fine white bread of England is a rare luxury. Instead, you eat cornbread, johnny cakes, and a thick porridge called hasty pudding that is exactly as appealing as it sounds. Meat comes primarily from pigs, which are hardy, easy to raise, and can be preserved through salting and smoking. Pork in various forms, bacon, ham, salt pork, is the protein backbone of the New England diet. Beef is less common, as cattle are more valuable for milk and labor. Chickens provide eggs and occasional meat. Wild game supplements the domestic animals. Deer, turkey, rabbit, whatever can be shot or trapped. Fish should be abundant, given the proximity to the Atlantic, but in winter, fishing is dangerous and difficult. Salted cod is available, though it requires extensive soaking before it's edible. Shellfish are gathered when possible, but in deep winter, fresh fish is essentially unavailable. Vegetables are limited to what can be stored. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, cabbages, onions. These root vegetables, buried in sand in the cellar, provide crucial nutrients through the winter months. Beans and peas are dried and stored. Pumpkins and squash keep for months if properly cured. But by February, the variety is minimal, and everything tastes vaguely of cellar. Fruit is preserved as much as possible. Apples are the most important fruit crop, pressed into cider that serves as the primary beverage for most families. Cider doesn't freeze as readily as water, and the slight alcohol content makes it safer than water from questionable sources. Everyone drinks cider, including children. Spices are expensive and used sparingly. Salt is essential for preservation. Sugar is a luxury, replaced by molasses or maple syrup when sweetness is needed. The overall flavor profile of the Puritan diet is bland, salty, and monotonous. Hunger is common, especially among the poor. The division between those who have enough and those who don't is stark and visible. When accusations of witchcraft begin, economic resentment will play a significant role. The woman with a full cellar, the family whose livestock thrives while yours sickens. These disparities breed suspicion, and suspicion breeds accusations. The meeting house stands at the center of Salem Village. And the meeting house is the center of everything. Not just religious life, but political life, social life, the entire structure of the community. To understand Salem in 1692, you must understand the absolute dominance of the Puritan Church. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded explicitly as a religious enterprise. The Puritans came here to create a society based on their interpretation of God's law, and they succeeded. Church and state are not merely connected. They are essentially the same thing. The same men who lead the congregation often serve as magistrates and selectmen. The same laws that govern civil life are derived from Scripture. There is no separation, no secular sphere where religion does not reach. Church membership is not automatic. You cannot simply attend services and call yourself a member. To become a full member of the congregation, you must provide evidence of your conversion, a personal narrative describing how God's grace entered your life and transformed you. This narrative is examined by the minister and the existing members, who determine whether your experience is genuine. Many people attend church their entire lives without ever achieving full membership. Only full church members can vote in colony elections. Only full church members can have their children baptized. Church membership confers status, privilege, and power. Those outside the membership are second-class citizens in a very real sense, tolerated but not fully accepted. The minister of Salem Village in 1692 is Samuel Parris, a failed merchant who turned to the ministry as a second career. Parris is not a popular figure. He has been fighting with his congregation over his salary, his firewood allotment, and his demand that the parsonage be deeded to him personally. These petty conflicts have divided the village into pro-Parris and anti-Parris factions, a division that will map almost perfectly onto the pattern of accusers and accused in the coming trials. The sermons Parris preaches are dark, apocalyptic, focused on the constant threat of Satan and the spiritual warfare that surrounds the village. He sees enemies everywhere, in the unconverted, in the half-hearted, in those who oppose him. His paranoid worldview will help create the conditions for the witch panic, and his household will be ground zero for the outbreak. The meeting house itself is a plain wooden structure, intentionally unadorned, because decoration is vanity, and vanity is sin. The benches are arranged so that everyone can see everyone else. Seating is assigned by status, the wealthy and prominent in the best seats, the poor and marginal in the back and sides. Your place in the meeting house reflects your place in society, and everyone knows exactly where they stand. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. The story is about to get complicated, and understanding the social dynamics is crucial to understanding why Salem Village tore itself apart. Salem Village is not actually Salem. This confuses people, but the distinction matters enormously. Salem town is a prosperous seaport on Massachusetts Bay, one of the largest and wealthiest communities in New England. Its merchants trade with the Caribbean, Europe, and other colonies. Its residents are cosmopolitan by colonial standards, connected to the wider Atlantic world, focused on commerce and profit. Salem Village is a farming community about 5 miles inland, technically part of Salem town, but culturally and economically distinct. The villagers are farmers, not merchants. They are poorer, more isolated, more conservative in their religious views. They resent the town's control over their affairs. It's taxation without adequate representation. It's apparent indifference to their concerns. For years, Salem Village has been petitioning for independence, the right to form their own church and govern their own affairs. They have succeeded in getting their own meeting house and their own minister, but they remain legally and politically subordinate to Salem town. This creates constant friction. The conflict isn't just between village and town. It's within the village itself. The eastern part of Salem Village, closer to the town, is wealthier and more commercially oriented. These families often have business ties to Salem town and identify more with its interests. The western part of the village is poorer, more agricultural, more resentful of outside influence. The Putnam family dominates the western faction. They are numerous, land-rich, but cash-poor, and engaged in various property disputes with their neighbors. Thomas Putnam, in particular, has grievances. He feels cheated out of an inheritance, blocked from political office, disrespected by those he considers his inferiors. His wife, Ann Putnam Sr., shares his bitterness. Their 12-year-old daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., will become the most prolific accuser in the witch trials. The Porter family leads the eastern faction. They are merchants and entrepreneurs, connected to Salem town, less invested in the village's religious politics. They have clashed with the Putnams over land, over church affairs, over nearly everything. When the witch accusations begin, they will follow these factional lines with remarkable consistency. The accusers will be overwhelmingly from the Putnam faction. The accused will be disproportionately connected to the Porter faction or otherwise, marginalized from the village's dominant group. The witch trials are, among other things, a continuation of this long-standing conflict by supernatural means that it begins in the parsonage, in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, in the coldest weeks of January 1692. Betty Parris is 9 years old. Abigail Williams, her cousin and servant in the household, is 11. They are children confined to a dark house in a frozen village, with little to do and a heavy weight of religious expectation pressing down on them. What exactly they were doing before the fits began is unclear. Later speculation will focus on fortune-telling games, perhaps taught to them by Tituba, the enslaved woman in the Parris household. But the truth is, we don't really know. What we know is that the girls began behaving strangely. They screamed for no apparent reason. They threw things. They crawled under furniture and contorted their bodies into unnatural positions. They claimed to see things that others couldn't see, to feel things pinching and biting them that others couldn't feel. They interrupted church services with their outbursts, behavior that would normally bring severe punishment, but that was clearly not within their control. Reverend Parris tried prayer. He tried fasting. He invited other ministers to observe the girls and offer guidance. Nothing helped. The fits continued and even worsened. In February, Dr. William Griggs examined the girls and delivered his diagnosis. They were suffering from the effects of witchcraft. This was not an unusual conclusion by the standards of the time. When illness had no apparent natural cause, supernatural causes were seriously considered. Witchcraft was not superstition to these people. It was a documented reality, supported by Scripture, confirmed by learned authorities, and prosecuted by courts throughout the Christian world. Once the diagnosis was made, the obvious question followed: who was responsible? Who had bewitched these innocent children? The pressure to name names was intense. The girls initially resisted, but eventually Under sustained questioning from adults who clearly expected answers, they began to provide them. The first three accused were Tituba, the Paris family slave; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar known for her surly attitude; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the village by living with her second husband before they were officially married. These first three accused fit a pattern. They were marginal, vulnerable, already suspected of moral failings. They were safe targets, people with few defenders. But they were only the beginning. Tituba's confession is the spark that ignites the inferno. Without it, the Salem witch trials might have ended with 3 accused women and no executions. With it, the floodgates open. We need to understand who Tituba was. She was an enslaved woman, probably of South American or Caribbean origin, purchased by Samuel Paris when he lived in Barbados and brought to Massachusetts as part of his household. She had no legal rights, no social standing, no one to protect her. When accused of witchcraft, she faced the prospect of torture and execution with no resources whatsoever. Under interrogation, Tituba confessed. And she didn't just confess to her own guilt. She described an elaborate conspiracy of witches operating in Salem Village. She spoke of a tall man from Boston who made her sign the devil's book. She spoke of other witches, unnamed but numerous, who served Satan alongside her. She described witch meetings, spectral animals, implements of magical harm. Whether Tituba believed what she was saying, whether she was telling her interrogators what they wanted to hear, or whether she was deliberately creating chaos to deflect attention from herself, we cannot know. What we know is that her confession transformed the situation completely. Before Tituba's confession, Salem had 3 accused witches. 2 of them denied the charges. After her confession, Salem had proof that a witch conspiracy existed and that an unknown number of additional witches remained at large. The hunt was on Sarah Good, despite being a poor beggar, maintained her innocence defiantly. When asked if she was a witch, she reportedly replied, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." This defiance did not help her case. Sarah Osborne also denied the charges and suggested that she herself might have been bewitched rather than being a witch. She was in poor health and would die in prison before she could be tried. But it was Tituba's confession that mattered most. She had confirmed the community's worst fears. The devil was actively recruiting in Salem Village. The question was no longer whether witches existed, but how many there were and how to find them all. The afflicted girls, validated by Tituba's confession, began to name more names. And the adults of Salem Village, terrified by the implications, began to listen. To understand the Salem witch trials, you need to understand the mechanics of accusation. Because the system, once set in motion, was almost impossible to escape. The afflicted girls Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon others who joined them claimed to be tormented by specters, the spiritual forms of witches who attacked them invisibly. During examinations, the girls would writhe, scream, and claim to see the specter of the accused tormenting them in real time. They would fall into fits when the accused looked at them, recover when the accused was forced to touch them. This spectral evidence was the key to everything. A witch, according to the belief of the time, could send her specter out to do harm while her physical body remained elsewhere. This meant that an accused person could be going about their normal business in plain sight, while their specter was simultaneously tormenting the afflicted girls miles away. You couldn't prove you weren't a witch by establishing an alibi, because your specter didn't need an alibi. The logic was circular and perfect. If the afflicted girls said your specter was tormenting them, you were guilty. If you denied it, you were lying, which was exactly what a witch would do. If you maintained your innocence, you were clearly in league with the devil, who gave his servants the ability to deceive. If you confessed, your confession proved the reality of witchcraft and validated the entire system. Accusations could come from anyone, but they followed certain patterns. The afflicted girls were the primary accusers, but adults joined in as well. Suddenly remembering misfortunes from years past, they could now be attributed to witchcraft. Your cow died unexpectedly? Perhaps that woman who came to your door, asking for food, and left muttering when you refused her. Perhaps she cursed you. Your child fell ill? Perhaps the old woman who looked at him strangely in the marketplace had cast the evil eye. The accused had no effective defense. They could not confront their accusers, because the accusers claimed to be tormented by invisible specters. They could not call witnesses to their character, because any witness who spoke favorably might themselves be accused of being in league with the witch. They could not deny the charges, because denial was seen as further evidence of guilt. The only escape was confession. If you confessed to being a witch, renounced the devil, and named other witches, you would be spared at least temporarily. The authorities wanted information more than they wanted executions. But confession meant living as a confessed witch. Your reputation destroyed, your property forfeit, your soul damned by your own admission. Something remarkable happened in Salem Village. In the spring of 1692, a group of adolescent girls, normally the most powerless members of Puritan society, became the most powerful people in the community. If this content is helping you drift off to sleep, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives for your bedtime. Listening, the afflicted girls grew in number as the trials progressed. Beyond Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, they eventually included Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and several others. These girls ranged in age from about 9 to their late teens. Most were servants or relatives of the Putnam faction. Several had experienced trauma orphaned by Indian attacks, displaced from their homes, survivors of violence. In normal circumstances, these girls had no voice. They were expected to be silent, obedient, and invisible. Their opinions didn't matter. Their feelings didn't matter. They existed to serve their families and would eventually be transferred to the authority of husbands who would be chosen for them. But as the afflicted, they became celebrities. Adults hung on their every word. Magistrates treated their testimony as gospel truth. Ministers studied their fits for evidence of supernatural activity. They were the center of attention, the most important people in the room, their every utterance taken with deadly seriousness. The power must have been intoxicating. Point at someone, claim to see their specter, and that person would be arrested. Fall into fits when an accused person looked at you, and the court would see it as proof of guilt. The girls became the arbiters of life and death, their performances more compelling than any defense the accused could offer. Were they lying? Were they deluded? Were they genuinely suffering from some psychological condition that made them believe they saw what they claimed to see? The honest answer is that we don't know. Mass psychogenic illness, what used to be called mass hysteria, is a documented phenomenon that can produce genuine physical symptoms. The girls may have convinced themselves of the reality of their visions, or some of them may have been deliberately performing while others genuinely believed. Or the situation may have been more complex than any simple explanation allows. What we know is that the girls' testimony sent people to the gallows, and as long as the adults of Salem believed them, they had no reason to stop. Not all motivations in the Salem witch trials were supernatural. Many were depressingly mundane. Land, money, property, old grudges finally finding an outlet. Salem Village in 1692 was a community where land ownership defined wealth, status, and security. The original grants from the colonial government had been divided and subdivided across generations. Boundaries were disputed. Inheritances were a contest. Families who had lived side by side for decades harbored grievances over property lines, water rights, and grazing privileges. The Putnam family, central to the accusations, had numerous property disputes with their neighbors. Thomas Putnam's father had left a will that Thomas considered unjust, favoring his stepmother's children over him. Thomas had contested the will and lost. He had tried to claim land he believed was rightfully his and been blocked. His resentment simmered for years. When you map the accusations geographically, patterns emerge. The accusers tended to come from the western part of Salem Village, where the Putnam faction dominated. The accused tended to come from the eastern part, closer to Salem town, where their rivals held sway. The witch trials tracked the factional conflicts that had divided the village for decades. Consider Rebecca Nurse, one of the most prominent accused. She was an elderly, respected church member whose family had been involved in a property dispute with the Putnams. Despite her sterling reputation, she was accused, tried, and executed. Her sisters, Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce, were also accused. The Nurse family landholdings were considerable, and with the family destroyed, that land was suddenly available. Consider George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village who had left under bitter circumstances, partly over unpaid salary that the Putnams had blocked. Years later, he was accused of being not just a witch, but the ringleader of the witch conspiracy. He was brought back from Maine, where he had been serving as a minister, tried, and executed. The Putnams were heavily involved in his accusation. This is not to say that the accusers were cynically making up charges to steal property. Most of them probably believed in the reality of the witch threat. But that belief was shaped by pre-existing conflicts, and the accusations fell on those who were already enemies, already resented, already in the way. The witch trials were a weapon, and weapons are rarely aimed at random. When you are accused of witchcraft in Salem, the process begins with an examination before the local magistrates. This is not a trial. It's more like a grand jury proceeding, determining whether there's enough evidence to hold you for trial. But the examinations are public spectacles, conducted in the meeting house before the entire community, and they are designed not to determine guilt, but to confirm it. The magistrates conducting the examinations in Salem are John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, neither of whom has any legal training. They are prominent local men, chosen for their status rather than their expertise. Hathorne in particular is aggressive and prosecutorial, treating the accused as guilty from the opening question. The examination follows a predictable pattern. The accused is brought before the magistrates, often in chains. The afflicted girls are present, ready to perform their fits on cue. The questioning begins, and the questions are not designed to elicit truth, but to trap. Are you a witch? If you say yes, you've confessed. If you say no, you're lying, because the afflicted girls say you are, and they wouldn't lie about something so important. Why do you hurt these children? The question assumes you are hurting them. Any answer accepts that premise. What do you say to these witnesses? The witnesses are the afflicted girls, who fall into fits whenever you look at them, who scream that your specter is biting them, who point at empty air and describe the demons that attend you. What can you say? If the accused protests too strongly, Hathor notes their hostility, their lack of proper submission. If they weep, he notes their crocodile tears. If they remain calm, he notes their unnatural composure. Everything is evidence of guilt. Nothing is exculpatory. The afflicted girls are the star witnesses. They interrupt the proceedings with screams. They mimic the accused's movements, claiming that the witch is controlling them. If the accused clenches her fist, the girls cry out that they are being pinched. If the accused glances at them, they fall to the ground in convulsions. The audience watches in horror, convinced they are seeing proof of supernatural evil. At the end of the examination, the magistrates invariably find cause to hold the accused for trial. No one is ever released. The examinations are not proceedings where justice is done. They are ceremonies where guilt is confirmed and the community's fears are validated. You have been accused of witchcraft. You have been examined and found suspect. Now you are sent to prison to await trial. And prison in colonial Massachusetts is a nightmare you must pay to experience. The jails of Salem and the surrounding counties were never designed for a mass influx of prisoners. They are small, dark, and filthy, quickly overwhelmed by the flood of accused witches. Conditions are appalling even by 17th century standards. Prisoners are kept in chains. This is not optional. It is required because witches might otherwise escape using supernatural means. Heavy iron shackles bind your wrists and ankles, connected by chains that restrict movement and cause constant chafing and sores. The chains are expensive, and you must pay for them. You must also pay for the food you eat, the straw you sleep on, the minimal services the jail provides. If you cannot pay, you remain chained but starving. The cells are unheated in winter, stifling in summer. They are dark, with minimal ventilation. Sanitation consists of a bucket in the corner if you're lucky. Disease spreads quickly in these conditions. Several accused witches will die in prison before they can be tried, including Sarah Osborne, one of the first 3 accused. The prisoners include not just adults, but children. Dorcas Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, is accused and imprisoned. She will spend months in chains, and contemporaries report that the experience drives her mad, leaving her mentally damaged for the rest of her life. The spectacle of a 4-year-old in chains, accused of witchcraft, apparently troubled no one sufficiently to secure her release. Women who are pregnant are examined before execution to determine if they are with child. If pregnant, they are allowed to live until they give birth, because the innocent child should not be killed for the mother's sins. At least one accused witch, Elizabeth Proctor, survives because of her pregnancy. The prisons fill beyond capacity. Prisoners are transferred from Salem to Boston, to Ipswich, to Cambridge, anywhere with space. The accused range from beggars to wealthy landowners, from young children to elderly matriarchs. They share their cells, their chains, their fear of what awaits them when the trials finally begin. And they wait. Some will wait for months. The legal process grinds slowly, and the witch crisis has overwhelmed the colonial judicial system. All they can do is wait in the darkness and pray. In late May 1692, the new royal governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips, arrives in the colony and immediately confronts the witch crisis. The jails are overflowing. The community is in an uproar. Something must be done. Phipps's solution is to establish a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and determine the witchcraft cases. The name comes from the French, to hear and to determine. The court is given broad authority to try the accused and render verdicts. The trials can finally begin. The judges appointed to the court are prominent men of the colony, but none of them are trained lawyers. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, is a former minister and politician known for his harsh views. He will prove to be the driving force behind the court's aggressiveness, consistently ruling against the accused and in favor of the prosecution. Samuel Sewell, another judge, will later become the only one to publicly apologize for his role in the trials. The court's procedures are not designed to protect the accused. Spectral evidence is admitted over the objections of some ministers who point out the theological problems with allowing testimony about invisible spirits. The accused are not allowed counsel. The burden of proof, such as it exists, falls on the defense to prove innocence rather than on the prosecution to prove guilt. The first trial is held on June 2, 1692. The defendant is Bridget Bishop, a woman with a colorful reputation who had previously been accused of witchcraft and acquitted. She runs a tavern where people drink, play games, and enjoy themselves in ways that Puritans find suspicious. Her clothing is considered immodest. She has been heard to speak sharply to her husband. The afflicted girls perform their usual routine, falling into fits when Bishop looks at them. Testimony is given about strange occurrences attributed to her witchcraft. A search of her house finds suspicious items, including dolls stuck with pins. The jury deliberates briefly and returns a verdict of guilty. Bridget Bishop is sentenced to death. 8 days later, on June 10th, she becomes the first person executed in the Salem witch trials. Hanged on what will become known as Gallows Hill, she maintains her innocence to the end. The court has drawn first blood. The executions will now come in waves. The single most controversial aspect of the Salem witch trials, then and now, is the use of spectral evidence. Understanding what spectral evidence was and why it was so problematic is essential to understanding how the trials went so wrong. If you're still with me on this dark journey, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment about what aspect of this story you find most troubling. Sweet dreams of Puritan justice ahead. Spectral evidence is testimony about what the specter or spirit of the accused did, rather than what the accused person physically did. When an afflicted girl said that she saw Sarah Good's specter pinching her, that testimony was spectral evidence. When witnesses described seeing the shape of an accused witch in their bedrooms at night, that was spectral evidence. The theological problem with spectral evidence is significant. For a witch's specter to torment someone, that witch must have given the devil permission to use their form. But could the devil use an innocent person's form without their permission? If so, spectral evidence proved nothing. The devil might be framing innocent people by appearing in their shapes. This question was hotly debated among New England's ministers. Increase Mather, one of the most prominent, argued that the devil could indeed take the shape of an innocent person, and therefore spectral evidence alone should not be sufficient for conviction. Others disagreed, arguing that God would not allow the devil to impersonate the innocent. The court of Oyer and Terminer, guided by William Stoughton, chose to admit spectral evidence. This decision was fateful. Without spectral evidence, the trials would have collapsed for lack of proof. With it, anyone could be convicted based on the visions of the afflicted. The absurdity of the situation was apparent to some at the time. How could you defend yourself against accusations about what your invisible spirit was doing while you were somewhere else? How could you prove that you hadn't sent your specter to torment someone in their sleep? The accusation was unfalsifiable by design. When the afflicted girls said they saw your specter, that was proof you were a witch. When you denied it, your denial was meaningless because, of course, a witch would deny it. When you demanded evidence, the evidence was the testimony of the afflicted. The system was closed, perfect, and lethal. As the trials progressed, something interesting happened. Anyone who questioned the accusers found themselves accused. John Proctor was a successful farmer and tavern keeper who publicly dismissed the proceedings as nonsense. He said the afflicted girls should be whipped until they stopped their lies. He called the entire business a fraud. And then, suddenly, the afflicted girls began to see John Proctor's specter tormenting them. He was arrested, tried, and executed. Martha Corey was a respected church member who expressed skepticism about the reality of the witch threat. She suggested that the afflicted girls might be lying. Almost immediately, Ann Putnam Jr. accused Martha Corey of being a witch. When Corey's husband Giles defended her, he too was accused. Both were arrested. The pattern repeated again and again. Doubt the proceedings, and you become suspect. Defend an accused witch, and you become suspect. Express sympathy for those imprisoned, and you become suspect. The accusations became a weapon to silence any opposition. This created a climate of total fear. People who privately believed the trials were unjust dared not say so. Speaking out meant potential death. The only safe position was enthusiastic support for the witch hunt, and even that wasn't always enough to protect you. The afflicted girls learned that they could accuse anyone with impunity. They accused a former minister, George Burroughs, of being the ringleader of the witches. They accused a wealthy merchant, Philip English, and his wife. They accused people from neighboring towns who had no connection to Salem Village. The accusations spiraled outward, engulfing more and more of the community. Some people fled rather than face accusation. Philip English escaped to New York with his wife. Others went into hiding, constantly moving to stay ahead of the warrants. But most people couldn't flee. They had farms, families, obligations. They had to stay and hope they wouldn't be named. The accusers faced no consequences for their accusations. If an accused person was found guilty, that validated the accusation. If an accused person was found innocent, which almost never happened, the accusers weren't punished for making a false accusation. They were simply mistaken, perhaps deceived by the devil into seeing the wrong specter. The system protected them absolutely. Here is the terrible paradox at the heart of the Salem witch trials. Those who confessed to being witches were spared, while those who maintained their innocence were executed. This seems backwards. If you confess to trafficking with the devil, surely you deserve death more than someone who denies the charges. But the logic of Salem ran differently. The authorities wanted confessions not primarily for punishment, but for information. A confessed witch could name other witches. A confessed witch validated the entire enterprise, proving that the witch conspiracy was real. A confessed witch had, in a sense, returned to God's fold by acknowledging their sin. They could be rehabilitated. Someone who denied being a witch, on the other hand, was clearly lying. The afflicted girls had seen their specter. Witnesses had testified to their evil deeds. The evidence was overwhelming. A denial in the face of such evidence proved the accused was hardened in sin, unrepentant, beyond hope of salvation. Such a person had to be removed from the community. The result was a system that incentivized false confession. If you confessed, you would be imprisoned, but not executed. At least not immediately. Your confession would be recorded, used as evidence against others, and held against you indefinitely, but you would live. If you maintained your innocence, you would hang. About 50 people confessed to witchcraft during the Salem trials. None of them were executed. 20 people who maintained their innocence died. The math was simple. Lie and live, or tell the truth and die. Many of the accused faced this choice knowingly. Rebecca Nurse, elderly and pious, could have saved her life by confessing. She refused, saying she could not damn her soul with a lie to save her body. Margaret Jacobs confessed, then recanted, knowing that her recantation might mean her death. She wrote a letter begging forgiveness from George Burroughs and John Proctor, whom she had named in her confession, before they were executed. The confessions fed the machine. Each confession named more names. Each name became a new accusation. Each accusation led to more arrests. The confessors, desperate to satisfy their interrogators, invented elaborate stories of witch meetings, devil worship, and supernatural mischief. The authorities wrote it all down and treated it as proof of the vast conspiracy they had always suspected. June 10, 1692. Bridget Bishop is led from the prison to Gallows Hill, a rocky outcrop overlooking Salem town. She is about 60 years old, a twice-widowed tavern keeper, known for her colorful clothing and sharp tongue. In a few minutes, she will become the first person executed in the Salem witch trials. Bridget Bishop was, by Puritan standards, a problematic woman even before the witch accusations. She ran an unlicensed tavern where people drank cider and played shuffleboard late into the night. Her clothing was considered too flashy. She favored a red bodice that scandalized her neighbors. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, in 1680, though she was acquitted. The evidence against her in 1692 was typical of the trials. The afflicted girls claimed to see her specter tormenting them. Neighbors testified about mysterious illnesses and deaths that had followed quarrels with Bishop. Workers who had done repairs on her house claimed to have found dolls made of rags and pig bristles, stuck with pins hidden in the walls. Bishop denied everything. She denied being a witch. She denied knowing about the dolls. She denied even knowing what a witch was. None of it mattered. The court found her guilty and sentenced her to death. On the morning of June 10th, Bishop was loaded into a cart and driven to the execution site. The hangings in Salem were not the clean drop and snap of later centuries. They were short drop hangings where the condemned was pushed off a ladder or cart and strangled slowly, kicking and struggling while the crowd watched. Bishop was hanged and died. Her body was buried in a shallow grave somewhere near the gallows. As an executed witch, she could not be buried in consecrated ground. Her exact burial place is unknown. A single execution, might have satisfied the community's bloodlust and ended the crisis. But it didn't. Bridget Bishop's death proved that the court was serious, that witches would be found and destroyed. The trials accelerated. More examinations, more confessions, more accusations. The summer of 1692 was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. After Bridget Bishop, the executions came in waves. July 19th, 5 hanged. August 19th, 5 more, including a minister. September 22nd, 8 people, the largest mass execution of the trials. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge saw 20 people die. The execution site was not chosen randomly. It was a rocky outcrop visible from Salem town, a public location where the entire community could witness the consequences of dealing with the devil. Crowds gathered for each hanging, watching as their neighbors, their friends, sometimes their family members were put to death. The condemned were transported by cart from the prison to the gallows. They were allowed to speak their final words, and many used this opportunity to protest their innocence one last time. Their protests fell on deaf ears. The crowd had come to see witches die, and witches they would see. George Burroughs, the former minister accused of being the ringleader of the witches, caused a moment of crisis on August 19th. Standing on the ladder with the rope around his neck, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. According to popular belief, witches could not recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling. Burroughs's flawless recitation should have proved his innocence. The crowd wavered. Some called for his release. But Cotton Mather, a prominent minister who had come to witness the execution, calmed them. He reminded them that Burroughs had been tried and convicted by lawful process. He suggested that the devil was capable of helping his servants deceive the people even in their final moments. Burroughs was hanged anyway. The bodies of the executed were treated with contempt. They could not be buried in church graveyards because their souls belonged to Satan. They were dunked in shallow graves near the execution site, sometimes barely covered with dirt. According to legend, Burroughs's chin and one hand were left exposed, though this may be apocryphal. Each execution was supposed to cleanse the community of evil. Instead, each execution led to more accusations. The afflicted were not satisfied. The witch conspiracies seemed to grow larger with every confession. The summer of 1692 was a season of death, and there seemed to be no end in sight. Giles Corey's death is the most horrifying of all the Salem executions. And it didn't even happen on the gallows. Corey was an 81-year-old farmer, a cantankerous old man with a troubled past. Decades earlier, he had been accused of beating a servant to death, though he escaped with a fine. He had testified against his own wife Martha when she was accused of witchcraft, testimony he later regretted. Then, inevitably, he himself was accused. Corey faced a dilemma. If he entered a plea guilty or not guilty, he would be tried, and trial almost certainly meant conviction and execution. But more than that, a conviction meant that his property could be seized by the state, leaving his sons with nothing. So Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. Under English law at the time, a defendant who refused to plead could be subjected to peine forte et dure, pressing with heavy weights until they either entered a plea or died. It was a form of judicial torture designed to force compliance with court procedures. On September 17, 1692, Giles Corey was taken to a field next to the jail. He was stripped naked. A wooden board was placed on his chest, and heavy stones were piled on top. The weight was increased gradually, crushing his ribcage, forcing the air from his lungs. According to witnesses, the pressing lasted 2 or 3 days. The sheriff, George Corwin, repeatedly asked Corey to enter a plea. Corey's only response, according to legend, was to gasp out the words, "More weight." He died without ever pleading, his silence protecting his estate for his heirs. Giles, Corey's death by pressing, was the only such execution in American history. His wife Martha was hanged 5 days later. Their deaths seemed to shock some members of the community into recognizing the horror of what they were doing. Whether Corey actually said, "More weight," is uncertain. The phrase may be a later embellishment. But his refusal to participate in a system he recognized as unjust, even at the cost of a slow and agonizing death, has made him a symbol of resistance to the trials. As the trials progressed, patterns became visible in who was accused and who did the accusing. These patterns reveal that the witch trials were not random but followed the fault lines of Salem Village's social conflicts. If you're still with me in this dark chapter of history, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. I read every single one, and your engagement helps determine what topics I cover next. The accusers were overwhelmingly connected to the Putnam family and their allies in the western part of Salem Village. And Putnam Jr., age 12, was the most prolific accuser, naming more than 60 people. Her parents, Thomas and Ann Putnam Sr., were heavily involved in supporting the accusations. Other accusers were servants or relatives of the Putnam faction. The accused showed distinct patterns as well. Many were connected to the Porter family or the eastern faction of the village. Many had been involved in property disputes with the Putnams or their allies. Many were women who didn't fit the Puritan ideal, too independent, too outspoken, too unwilling to accept their subordinate position. Women accused of witchcraft tended to share certain characteristics. Many were older, past childbearing age, no longer under the direct authority of a husband or father. Many had inherited property or stood to inherit property, making them anomalies in a society where men controlled wealth. Many had reputations for speaking their minds, for being difficult, for failing to show proper deference. But men were accused too, especially as the trials escalated. The men accused were often those who defended accused women, husbands, sons, supporters. They were also men who had crossed the Putnams or expressed skepticism about the proceedings. Several of the accused came from outside Salem Village entirely, as the afflicted girls began naming people from neighboring towns. This expansion of the accusations eventually became their undoing, as the circle grew wide enough to include people with the power to push back. The demographic patterns suggest that the witch trials were, at least in part, a mechanism for settling old scores and eliminating troublesome members of the community. Accusations fell on the vulnerable, the marginal, the disliked. The witch hunt was a weapon, and those who wielded it knew exactly who they wanted to. Destroy. The Salem witch trials ended not because the community came to its senses, but because the accusations finally reached too high. Throughout the summer and early fall of 1692. The circle of accused had been expanding. Starting with marginal figures like Tituba and Sarah Good, it had grown to include church members in good standing, wealthy merchants, and even ministers. Each expansion of the circle should have raised doubts about the reliability of the accusations. Instead, It seemed to confirm that the witch conspiracy was even larger than anyone had imagined. But then the afflicted girls went too far. They began to accuse people connected to the colonial government. They named the wife of Governor William Phips herself. Lady Mary Phips was not some marginal figure who could be sacrificed to community hysteria. She was the governor's wife, at the pinnacle of colonial society. If the accusations could reach her, no one was safe, including the judges who were conducting the trials. Including the accusers themselves, Governor Phips had been largely absent during the trials, engaged in military operations on the frontier. When he returned and learned that his own wife had been accused, his perspective on the proceedings shifted dramatically. In October 1692, Phips ordered that spectral evidence should no longer be admitted in the trials. This was the death blow to the prosecutions. Without spectral evidence, there was no evidence. The confessions had been coerced. The physical evidence was circumstantial. The entire case against the accused rested on the visions of the afflicted, and those visions were suddenly inadmissible. Phips dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The remaining cases were transferred to a regular court, which, operating without spectral evidence, acquitted most of the accused. Those still in prison were gradually released, though they had to pay their jail fees first. Some remained imprisoned for months, simply because they couldn't afford to buy their freedom. The witch trials were over, not because the community recognized its error, not because justice reasserted itself, but because the accusations finally threatened people with the power to stop them. The end came swiftly once the spectral evidence was excluded. Without the visions of the afflicted girls, there was nothing to support the charges. In January 1693, a superior court convened to try the remaining cases. Of the 52 people tried, 49 were acquitted. The 3 who were convicted were immediately reprieved by Governor Phips. No one else would die for witchcraft in Salem. The afflicted girls attempted to continue their accusations, but without legal support, their power evaporated. One by one, they faded back into obscurity. And Putnam Jr. would later issue a public apology, though not until 1706, 14 years after the trials. Most of the other accusers never publicly acknowledged any wrongdoing. The prisons slowly emptied. The accused who had been waiting months for trial were released, though many were financially ruined. They had to pay for their imprisonment, the food, the chains, the cell itself. Some had lost their property while imprisoned, seized by creditors, or simply stolen. They emerged into a world that had no place for them. The confessors faced particular difficulty. They had saved their lives by admitting to being witches, but their confessions remained on record. They were living as confessed servants of the devil, their reputations destroyed, their testimonies forever tainted by their own words. Some recanted, admitting that they had lied to save themselves. Others maintained silence, unwilling to revisit the trauma. The executed remained dead. Their families had lost parents, spouses, children to the gallows. Some of the executed had their property seized, leaving their heirs destitute. The bodies buried in shallow graves near the execution site were never properly recovered, or Salem Village itself was traumatized, divided between those who had supported the trials and those who had suffered from them. The factional conflicts that had fueled the accusations continued long after the trials ended. Some families never forgave their neighbors. The wounds would take generations to heal. The witch trials had lasted less than a year. Their effects would last centuries. In the immediate aftermath of the Salem witch trials, there was no reckoning, no justice, no accountability. The people who had sent their neighbors to die went home and resumed their lives as if nothing had happened. The judges faced no consequences. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice whose aggressive rulings had ensured conviction after conviction, became acting governor of Massachusetts after Phipps died. He never expressed regret. When Governor Phipps suggested pardoning the remaining accused, Stoughton reportedly flew into a rage. Furious that his work was being undone, the accusers faced no consequences. The afflicted girls who had pointed fingers and named names returned to their normal lives. Some married, had children, lived into old age. They were not prosecuted for perjury or false accusation. They were not required to compensate the families of those they had. Destroyed. The ministers who had encouraged the trials largely escaped criticism. Cotton Mather, who had supported the proceedings and published a defense of them, remained one of the most prominent clergymen in New England. His father, Increase Mather, had actually cautioned against relying on spectral evidence. But even he had not spoken out until the trials were nearly over. The only public acknowledgement of wrongdoing came slowly and partially. In 1696, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and prayer for the sins committed during the trials, though it stopped short of admitting the court had acted wrongly. In 1697, Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood in his church and had his confession of error read aloud while he bowed his head. He was the only judge to publicly apologize. N. Putnam, Jr., the most prolific accuser, made a public confession in 1706. Standing in the Salem Village meeting house while the minister read her statement, she said she had been deceived by the devil into accusing innocent people. She asked forgiveness from God and from the families of those who had died. But she also claimed she had acted not out of malice, but out of delusion, placing the blame on Satan rather than herself. The families of the executed received no compensation. Some petitioned for years to have their relatives' names cleared and their property restored. The process was slow, grudging, and incomplete. Salem Village would never be the same. The community that had torn itself apart over witchcraft had to somehow continue living together. Victims and accusers, bereaved families, and unrepentant persecutors, all sharing the same meeting house, the same streets, the same small world. The factional conflicts that had fueled the trials continued. The Putnams and their allies remained at odds with the Porters and their faction. Samuel Parris, the minister whose household had been ground zero for the outbreak, was eventually forced out in 1697 after years of bitter fighting. He never admitted any responsibility for what had happened. The village petitioned for and received permission to change its name. In 1752, Salem Village became Danvers, a fresh start, an attempt to escape the weight of history. Salem town retained the name Salem, but the witch trials would define its identity forever. The executed remained officially guilty for decades. It was not until 1711 that the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill reversing the convictions and providing modest compensation to the families of the victims. Even then, some names were omitted from the reversal, leaving some of the executed still technically guilty of witchcraft. The final legal reversal didn't come until 1957, when Massachusetts formally apologized for the trials. Even later, in 2001, The remaining unnamed victims were officially exonerated. More than 300 years after their deaths, the executed witches of Salem were finally declared innocent. Today, Salem embraces its dark heritage. The witch trials have become a tourist industry, complete with museums, monuments, and a kitschy culture of witch-themed shops and attractions. A memorial on the site of the executions, identified only in 2016 through archaeological research, lists the names of the 20 who died. But the real legacy of Salem is not the tourism or the memorials. It's the lesson about how easily fear can overwhelm justice, how quickly neighbors can become executioners, how the machinery of law can be turned to murderous ends by people who believe absolutely in their own righteousness. The people of Salem in 1692 were not monsters. They were ordinary people, frightened by forces they didn't understand, seeking explanations for their suffering, convinced that they were doing God's work. And in that conviction, they killed 20 innocent people and destroyed countless lives. It could happen again. It has happened again, in different forms, in different places. The names change, but the dynamics remain. Salem is not just history, it's a warning. And so our time in Salem draws to a close. The winter of 1692 eventually gave way to spring, then summer, then autumn. The executions ended. The prisons emptied. The afflicted girls stopped their fits, and the specters that had tormented them disappeared as suddenly as they had arrived. The survivors had to find ways to live with what had happened. Families who had lost members to the gallows had to see their accusers in church, at the market, on the roads that connected the scattered farmsteads of the village. Children who had watched parents hang had to grow up in a community that had killed them. Accusers who had sent neighbors to die had to face those neighbors' orphaned children. Some found ways to reconcile. Some never did. The wounds of 1692 passed down through generations, remembered in family stories, recorded in documents that survive to this day. What can we learn from Salem? Perhaps that certainty is dangerous. The people who conducted the witch trials were absolutely certain they were right. The judges who condemned the accused, the ministers who supported the prosecutions, the afflicted girls who named names, all of them believed they were fighting evil, serving God, protecting their community. Their certainty made them capable of atrocity. Perhaps we learn that systems matter. The Salem witch trials were not the result of one evil person or one bad decision. They were the product of a system, a legal system that admitted spectral evidence, a religious system that made the devil a constant presence, a social system that silenced dissent. The individuals who participated in the trials were mostly ordinary people. The system made them killers. Perhaps we learned that the vulnerable are always at risk. The first accused, Tituba the slave, Sarah Good the beggar, Sarah Osborne, the scandal were chosen because they were already marginal, already suspected, already lacking defenders. When fear takes hold, the people on the margins are the first to suffer. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, spare a thought for the 20 who died. They were real people with real lives, cut short by fear, uncertainty, and the terrible human capacity for cruelty. They deserve to be remembered not as witches, but as what they were. Victims of a society that lost its way. The night is dark, but it will not last forever. Sleep now. The specters that haunted Salem have long since faded. The only ghosts that remain are in memory. Rest well.